January 2006. Ramadi, Iraq. Colonel Sean MacFarland received his briefing on the situation in Ramadi and came to the conclusion that any reasonable officer would have come to after reviewing it. The situation was catastrophic. Ramadi was the capital of Anbar Province, a Sunni-majority region in western Iraq that had become the center of the Sunni insurgency against the American-led coalition and the new Iraqi government. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had established virtual control of the city, running its own courts, enforcing its own laws, collecting its own taxes, and killing anyone who opposed it with a systematic brutality that had paralyzed the local population and driven out every moderate political figure who had attempted to work within the governmental framework that the coalition was trying to build. The statistics that MacFarland reviewed reflected the depth of the problem. In 2006, Ramadi was experiencing an average of 25 attacks per day against coalition forces. American units that patrolled the city streets were ambushed with a regularity that made the patrols themselves a form of attrition warfare that was consuming American casualties without producing results. The Iraqi security forces that were supposed to be building the institutional capability to eventually take over from American forces were infiltrated, intimidated, and in many cases simply absent, their members having concluded that working with the coalition was a death sentence in a city where Al-Qaeda enforced its authority with car bombs and beheadings. The assessment that MacFarland's predecessors had reached, and that the conventional military logic of the situation supported, was that Ramadi could not be secured by military means alone. The insurgency that controlled the city had the active or passive support of the Sunni tribal population, who feared and resented Al-Qaeda but feared and resented the American presence and the Shia-dominated Iraqi government even more. Without winning over the Sunni tribes, without giving them a reason to cooperate with coalition forces rather than tolerate Al-Qaeda, military operations could kill insurgents but could not produce the security that the city needed. MacFarland understood this. He also understood something else that the conventional analysis did not fully account for, that Al-Qaeda in Iraq's methods were creating the conditions for exactly the kind of tribal backlash that could change the political dynamics of the Sunni community if someone could figure out how to facilitate it. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not the indigenous Sunni insurgency that had initially resisted the American invasion. It was a foreign-led organization that had imposed itself on the Sunni community with a combination of violence and ideology that the community had initially tolerated because the alternative, cooperation with the Americans and the Shia government, seemed worse. But Al-Qaeda's methods were becoming intolerable even to the people who had initially accepted them. Al-Qaeda was killing sheikhs who refused to provide support. It was forcing marriages between its fighters and the daughters of tribal families. It was destroying the economic activities, the sheep markets and the trade routes and the smuggling networks, on which the tribal economy depended. It was doing, in other words, what authoritarian movements do when they mistake the absence of resistance for genuine consent. It was pushing harder and harder against people who were not natural supporters and who were accumulating grievances that were looking for an outlet. MacFarland's insight was that the American military could provide that outlet if it approached the problem differently from the conventional counterinsurgency playbook. The conventional playbook said to avoid direct engagement with tribal leaders whose loyalty was uncertain, because making commitments to leaders who might later be shown to have Al-Qaeda connections would be a political embarrassment. MacFarland threw out that particular page and began meeting with every tribal sheikh in Anbar Province who was willing to meet with him. The meetings were not comfortable. The sheikhs had legitimate grievances about the American invasion and the de-Baathification policies that had destroyed the Sunni political establishment. They had legitimate concerns about the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. They had their own interests and their own calculations about which way the security situation was going to break and what side they wanted to be on when it broke. MacFarland listened to the grievances. He acknowledged the legitimate concerns. And he made an argument that he could back up with the military force under his command. He argued that Al-Qaeda was the common enemy. Not the Americans, not the Shia government, not the occupation. Al-Qaeda, which was killing sheikhs and forcing marriages and destroying the tribal economy and imposing a foreign ideology on a community that had its own traditions and its own customs and its own ways of resolving conflict that went back centuries. He argued that the American military could provide the security umbrella under which the tribes could fight back against Al-Qaeda if the tribes were willing to cooperate. He argued that the alternative to cooperation was continued Al-Qaeda control and the continued destruction of the tribal community's political, economic, and social structures. Sheikh Abdul Sattar Abu Risha was the tribal leader who made the argument real. Abu Risha was not the most powerful or most prominent sheikh in Anbar Province. He was a man in his 30s whose family had suffered directly at Al-Qaeda's hands, whose own business interests had been disrupted by Al-Qaeda's control of the trade routes, and who had concluded before MacFarland arrived that something had to change. He had reached out to previous American commanders and been rebuffed because the conventional assessment had placed him in a category of tribal leaders whose reliability was uncertain. MacFarland met with him. He listened to him. And in September 2006, Abu Risha stood up at a press conference flanked by American officers and announced the formation of what he called the Anbar Awakening, a tribal movement committed to fighting Al-Qaeda and cooperating with coalition forces. The announcement was simultaneously enormously significant and enormously dangerous. It was significant because Abu Risha's willingness to make a public declaration of opposition to Al-Qaeda was exactly the catalyst that the more cautious tribal leaders had been waiting for. If Abu Risha was going to do it publicly, others could follow without being the first. It was dangerous because Al-Qaeda understood immediately what the awakening represented and made Abu Risha's assassination a priority. The military component of what MacFarland was building required the American forces in Ramadi to actually provide the security umbrella that he had promised the tribal leaders. This meant taking and holding positions inside the city rather than patrolling through it, establishing combat outposts in the middle of insurgent-controlled neighborhoods, accepting the casualties that establishing those outposts would cost because the alternative was leaving the tribal leaders who had committed to the awakening without the military backing that made their commitment survivable. The combat outposts that the Ready First Brigade established in Ramadi in the second half of 2006 were among the most dangerous assignments in the Iraq War. Small groups of American soldiers and Marines established positions in buildings in the middle of neighborhoods that Al-Qaeda controlled, accepting the siege conditions that immediately followed, fighting off the attacks that came nightly, providing the visible American presence that signaled to the local population that the coalition was not going to leave. The fighting around the combat outposts was intense and sustained. Al-Qaeda attacks on the outposts were daily events, using car bombs and direct assault and sniper fire and the improvised explosive devices that had made Iraqi roads so deadly throughout the war. The soldiers and Marines in the outposts held their positions and continued to be present in the neighborhoods, and the local population that had been intimidated into silence by Al-Qaeda began to notice that the men who were not leaving were the Americans, not Al-Qaeda. The intelligence that the tribal cooperation began to generate was the tactical key to the military campaign. The sheikhs who had committed to the awakening provided information about Al-Qaeda positions and leadership that American intelligence had been unable to develop on its own. The local population that had been silent began providing tips to the combat outpost soldiers, information about IED emplacements and Al-Qaeda safehouses and the movement of Al-Qaeda leaders through the city. The intelligence allowed American Special Operations Forces to begin a targeted campaign against Al-Qaeda's leadership structure in Ramadi that the intelligence vacuum of the previous years had made impossible. SEAL platoons that were operating in support of MacFarland's brigade used the tribal intelligence to conduct precise operations against high-value Al-Qaeda targets, removing the leadership nodes that coordinated the insurgency's operations in the city. The Navy SEAL snipers who provided overwatch for the combat outposts and the clearing operations became a particular focus of Al-Qaeda's countermeasures, because their effectiveness in protecting American and Iraqi forces from insurgent fire was substantial enough that Al-Qaeda offered a bounty for information about their positions. Chief Petty Officer Chris Kyle, who would later write the memoir that became the basis for the film American Sniper, served multiple tours in Ramadi and the surrounding areas during this period, providing the overwatch and protection that the ground forces operating in the most dangerous parts of the city needed. His effectiveness was not measured in the same dramatic terms that the popular account of his career later emphasized, but in the specific military utility of a trained shooter who could identify and engage threats to ground forces at ranges that the insurgents had not prepared for. The combination of the tribal cooperation, the combat outpost strategy, and the targeted special operations campaign began to change the security situation in Ramadi in the fall and winter of 2006 to 2007 in ways that the statistics documented month by month. The attacks that had averaged 25 per day in early 2006 declined to 15 per day, then 10, then 5. The Iraqi police stations that had been empty because nobody was willing to serve filled as the awakening provided tribal members who were willing to carry a gun in defense of their own neighborhoods against Al-Qaeda. By early 2007, Ramadi had been transformed from the most dangerous city in Iraq to what General David Petraeus, who had taken command of multinational force Iraq and made the awakening model the centerpiece of his counterinsurgency strategy, called a model for what the surge could achieve across the country. The surge, the deployment of additional American forces to Iraq in 2007 combined with the counterinsurgency strategy that Petraeus had developed, was the policy that the Bush administration adopted in response to the deteriorating security situation of 2006. Ramadi was the proof of concept that the strategy was sound. The political acknowledgement of the awakening strategy did not reach Abu Risha himself. On September 13, 2007, exactly 1 year after he had stood at the press conference and announced the formation of the Anbar Awakening, Abu Risha was killed by a bomb that Al-Qaeda had planted near his home. He was 37 years old. His death was a demonstration of both Al-Qaeda's continued capacity for targeted violence and the limits of what the Awakening had been able to accomplish in terms of protecting its own leaders from assassination. But it was also, in the specific way that political martyrdom operates, a demonstration of what the movement he had started represented. The tribal leaders who might have been frightened back into silence by his assassination were not frightened back into silence. The awakening continued. The security gains that Ramadi had demonstrated continued and spread to other parts of Anbar Province and eventually to other Sunni-majority areas of Iraq. By 2008, Anbar Province had been transferred to Iraqi security control, the first province in Iraq to be transferred and the one that had seemed most intractable just 2 years earlier. The 25 attacks per day that had characterized Ramadi in early 2006 had declined to near zero. The transformation of Ramadi was not accomplished by military force alone. It was accomplished by military force combined with the kind of political intelligence that recognizes an opportunity that the conventional analysis has missed and the willingness to take the risks that pursuing that opportunity requires. MacFarland had taken the risk. Abu Risha had taken the larger risk. The soldiers and Marines who had held the combat outposts through the nights when Al-Qaeda was trying to destroy them had taken the risk that no amount of strategic analysis can substitute for, the risk of being present in the most dangerous place available and staying there. They stayed. The tribal leaders saw that they stayed. The population saw that they stayed. And the city changed. That is the Battle of Ramadi. Not a single dramatic engagement, but a year-long campaign that combined military force, political intelligence, and the particular courage of soldiers who held outposts in hostile neighborhoods because holding them was the only way to create the security conditions that allowed everything else to work. They held. The city changed. The war turned. In Ramadi, in the most dangerous city in Iraq in 2006, American soldiers and their tribal allies proved something that the strategic analysts who had written off Anbar Province had not believed was possible. They proved it by staying.